What's up, guys? So today's video is going to be pretty quick and pretty basic. Just to kind of recap what our last video was about, we talked about the pituitary gland. Specifically, we talked about the anterior pituitary gland and how we consider it one of the master endocrine glands. The reason for this is because of all the tropic hormones that this gland is going to release. Remember, when we say tropic, that means it's going to go and affect another endocrine gland, releasing more hormones. And so that's why this one's sometimes considered that master gland, because it's going to control the other endocrine glands. So we had tropic hormones like our follicle stimulating or the luteinizing hormone. Those are going to affect hormone development and other things inside the testes and the ovaries. Likewise, we're going to have the thyrotropic hormone that's going to go and react with the thyroid, and our adrenocorticotropic hormone, which of course will affect the adrenal cortex located on top of the kidney. Our two non-tropic hormones being the growth hormone and prolactin, which still play huge roles in our development. And so that's kind of where we left off yesterday. But today what we're going to be focusing on isn't so much the master endocrine gland portion. We're going to be looking at this little part that's even smaller that hangs at the back of the pituitary gland, the posterior section. In this posterior section, it's not as big of a player, you could say, in the sense of being a master gland like the anterior portion. And the reason for that is because this posterior portion actually doesn't make any hormones of its own. It's all going to rely on the hypothalamus. So let's go ahead and let's look at that, the pituitary hypothalamus relationship. So it's actually the hypothalamus itself that's going to be producing these hormones. And if you remember from our chapter over the brain, when we talk about the hypothalamus, that's the kind of like the emotional limbic system. That's where we're going to have things like dopamine and other chemicals that are being released, that reward center of the brain. And so two other hormones that are going to be produced there are oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. And both of these hormones are produced by the hypothalamus, but they're stored in the posterior pituitary. That's why, again, we say that it's not strictly an endocrine gland, but it does release hormones, so that's why we talk about it in this situation. And so let's take a closer look at these two hormones that we're going to be releasing from the posterior pituitary. The first one being oxytocin. Now, oxytocin has several different uses. One of the most common uses is during child labor. And what happens is there's a lot of oxytocin that is released during child labor to help with the contractions and to help stimulate that labor, to help the labor go smoothly. This protein, or this hormone, is actually released not through negative feedback in this case, but through positive feedback. In other words, something's happening in the system and we need a lot more of this hormone than should normally be there. Again, if you guys watch that Amoeba Sisters negative feedback and homeostasis video, highly recommend it because they do a great job explaining this. But long story short, when somebody goes into labor, all of a sudden that triggers this pituitary gland, this posterior pituitary, to release that oxytocin. And not only that though, the hypothalamus is going to start to produce more and more and more of this, and the pituitary gland is going to keep releasing it, and that hormone is going to help with these contractions, allowing the child to be birthed. Other things include sexual relations. That's the term that our book uses, but you could even think of a hug as this type of relation, because actually what's going on is oxytocin, some of you guys might have even heard this sometimes considered the love drug or the love hormone, because oxytocin, we've actually found out, plays a huge role in bonding relationships. Again, that's another reason sometimes people believe that it's released during breastfeeding. Now, yes, it does cause the milk to be able to come out during lactation. That's one of the uses of oxytocin, but oxytocin also kind of sets off some of those reward centers in the brain. It's that, hey, this feels good type idea, this hormone. And so sometimes it's considered the love drug for that reason. In other words, somebody gives you a hug, somebody gives you a pat on the back, somebody just shakes your hand, your brain releases a little bit of that oxytocin, and it's kind of like a reward center for you. This is the same thing that happens when you pet a dog or a cat. That's why we actually love having these pets around, is because of how much it allows us to release this oxytocin and give us this positive pleasure reward from the brain. And studies have even shown that it works both ways, that we've almost developed this symbiotic relationship with dogs, where when we scratch the dog's back, they get oxytocin that's released at the same time we do. And so we've developed this bond over all these years. And so, again, that's kind of why oxytocin is considered the love hormone or the love drug, but its main purpose is in childbirth and with the ability to lactate, to allow the milk to come out. The second one that's used here is the antidiuretic hormone. And some of you guys, if you remember from biology last year when we watched the video, Hold Your Wee for a Wee, it talked about this hormone. And again, if you haven't seen that video, the link's down in the description. But Hold Your Wee for a Wee talked about this lady who literally was in this competition where what they had to do was basically hold it in. They had to drink 3 gallons of water and hold it in, and whoever could hold it in the longest without having to go to the bathroom won a wee. It was a weird radio challenge, but nonetheless, what happened was, as this lady tried to hold back from going to the bathroom or tried to hold back from vomiting, in the video it talks about, spoiler alert, her brain released antidiuretic hormone. And diuretic, if you were like me and probably the first time you saw something that said diuretic, you automatically thought of diarrhea. That is not what we're talking about. Diuretic, the diarrhea is actually referring to Latin for like urine, for that liquid. And so an antidiuretic doesn't allow you to urinate. And again, this is important for several reasons. One of those being, like, if you're about to throw up, all of a sudden, if your body's triggered to where it says, oh, I'm going to throw up, all of a sudden, this posterior pituitary is going to release this antidiuretic hormone. Why is that? Well, it's the same reason that people tell you to drink a Gatorade or something after you have thrown up, or tell you to drink water, because you've become dehydrated from it, because your body has lost so many fluids from that. And so when our body senses that something like that is going to happen, it prepares itself for that. And so it releases this antidiuretic hormone. And what antidiuretic hormone does, like we said, long story short, it allows you, or it kind of hinders you from going to the bathroom. But the way it does that is by telling the kidneys, hey, we need to make sure that we don't let a lot of water go to the bladder. We need to make sure that we keep a lot of this in the bloodstream, because we think we're going to lose a lot of water, whether it be through sweat or throwing up. And so we need to try and hold on to as much water as we can. And that's why this is a really important hormone. However, though, sometimes an excess of this being released can cause vasoconstriction. In other words, where your very tiny arteries are going to start to contract and close, and so it's going to increase your blood pressure, and this is why sometimes it's known as vasopressin. So you might have heard of vasopressin. It's antidiuretic hormone. That's what we're talking about. And so last but not least, the last little thing I would kind of want to talk about today is the pineal gland. And again, if you're watching this and trying to follow along with your notes, you might think, well, wait a minute, this is kind of going out of order. Yes, it is. In fact, you don't even have notes for the pineal gland. So I'd write a little bit of this down probably. But long story short, the pineal gland, it does control, it is an endocrine gland because it's releasing hormones, and the main hormone that it's releasing is melatonin. And that melatonin might sound a little familiar from when we talked about the brain back in a few chapters ago as well. And this area where the pineal gland might even seem a little bit familiar, because if you remember, this area, this region, is the epithalamus. And so the pineal gland is actually found within the epithalamus of the brain. And if you remember back, that epithalamus was involved in our wake-sleep cycle and our biological rhythms. And so what's going to be happening here is, again, that pineal gland, when it's not getting the light signals like from the blue light or just sunlight, and it gets dark, that triggers it to start to release that melatonin, saying, hey, it's getting dark, we should probably go to bed. It releases that melatonin and lets you go to sleep. Now, some of you guys are probably, your sleep schedule is so totally whacked because of everything that's been going on, and you might be up all night and sleep during the day, and just because of all this craziness that's been going on with school. If you ever want to get back into your normal sleep cycle, like I've said before, one of the best things you can do is go camping for a couple days. Because what happens is when you're out there and you're exposed to the sun, and the sun specifically, and just that sunlight, when that sun goes down, your body realizes that it's nighttime, so you don't go inside where there's any lights or anything, and you don't go on your phone. And if you do that for a couple of days, it starts to get your body to where it's producing that melanin, or that melatonin, at the right time. And so again, that's how you can kind of reset your biological clock in that way. So, just to recap what we talked about today, we finished up discussing the pituitary gland. We talked about how the posterior pituitary isn't necessarily an endocrine gland, it's more so a storage for hormones that are produced by the hypothalamus itself. And so it's going to store those hormones in here. The two hormones it's going to store are ADH, which is our antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin. And again, these have different locations that they're going to go to throughout the body to target those specific areas. And then finally, we discussed the pineal gland and how that helps with our sleep cycles. It's part of the epithalamus, and that's pretty much it. So if you have any questions about this, feel free to let me know and remind, or you can bring it to our Zoom meeting that we're going to be having later on, or even the YouTube Live we do every Friday at 3. And remember, tomorrow is, you guys have that first part of our endocrine system review that you need to do, and then Friday is just a makeup day. So this is going to be our last video till next week, and until then, hope you guys do well.